All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video production of Herbs and Polis. If you are not familiar with Herbs and Polis, it's an online initiative, and our goal is to make the academic study of Christian origins and the fruit of that study more accessible to a public audience. So if you like what you hear today, I guess even if you don't, I encourage you to check out our website. I believe you can see our website posted there, www.herbsandpolis.com. You can subscribe to that website. You can follow us on social media. But there's a lot of good content there already. There are a number of blogs posted there. There are also a number of videos, including an excellent interview that was done, I think, a week or two ago that you can check out. It's very much like the format you're going to see today. And also, you can try and get free books. I believe there's like a free book giveaway. And one of the free books is written by the person that I'm going to have the pleasure of interviewing today. My name is Adam Winn. I am Associate Professor of Christian Studies at the University of Mary Hardin Baylor. That's in Central Texas. And I'm part of the Herbs and Polis Advisory Team. And today I have the privilege and pleasure of interviewing Dr. Christopher Zeichmann. I forgot to ask you this. Is Chris good?
Yeah, Chris is great.
All right, Chris is great. And interview him about his excellent book, The Roman Army and the New Testament. In fact, I have here it is right here. I have my own, there we go. I have my own copy of this book. Chris does as well. Excellent book. I'm excited to talk to Chris about this book today. Chris teaches at Ryerson University in Toronto. Does excellent work on the Greek and Roman context of the New Testament, a lot of work on the material world of the New Testament. This book is on the Roman army and its background for the New Testament, or as a background for the New Testament. This is an excellent example of Chris's work. He is also project manager for Brown University's Inscriptions of Israel and Palestine project, which I'm very interested in, Chris. And I don't know if we might not have time to talk about it today, but I'd like to hear more about what you're doing there. For more on Chris, I would point you to the Herbs and Polis website. He's got a bio there. All of us have bios there, so if you want to go check that out, you can. Chris, how you doing?
Doing wonderful. How about you, Adam?
I'm doing great. It's a Friday.
It is a Friday. We got a weekend ahead of us. It's reading week here in Canada. So I live in Toronto. Ooh. And so it's Thanksgiving earlier this week. I'm an American expatriate living in Canada. So this is reading week. So it's kind of nice to be able to have a week where I'm just marking papers and not teaching on top of it too. So I hope things are going well there for you.
They are, and I'm envious of your reading week. I think the reading week is a tradition that more American universities need to embrace.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, no, what do we got? Like a month until Thanksgiving here. And
yeah.
So, yeah, I'm waiting for a break, but it'll get here, I'm sure, soon enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
Eventually,
Chris, it's great to. I mean, we've interacted a ton in the past, or we've interacted some in the past, back and forth, messaging and email and everything. But
yeah, absolutely.
Great to finally meet you. I really enjoyed your work and look forward to talking to you about your book.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam. It's great to, I appreciate the correspondence we've had so far, and I'm excited to finally get a chance to talk to you digital face-to-face for the first time, despite our correspondence over the years and everything. And certainly it means a lot to have you do it because, kind of your work, your published dissertation, The Purpose of the Gospel, Mark, was something that got me interested in these sorts of questions to begin with, right? Oh. So at the beginning of my own doctoral studies, so it means a lot to have you as part of this conversation today.
Oh, wow. I'm honored. So you read, that's great. Somebody read it. That's fantastic. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that, Chris. Well, let's jump into talking about your book. Mm-hmm. It's an excellent book. I've had a chance to read it. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. Why don't you start off by, it's a book that's on the Roman army in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. So why don't you start off by just telling us a little bit about why there was a need for this book? Like, what was the gap in scholarship that you saw that said, hey, we need some updated work on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of my interest in this question first really began with a class I was taking on Q and in my PhD studies. And I was doing this research on the healing of the centurion's slave. So Luke chapter 7, Matthew chapter 8, and wanted to kind of dive into this. I realized just how little work had been done on the military in the New Testament, right? So, and one big part of that, it surprised me because there was a lot of work like yours and other people where kind of the Roman Empire has been a very hot topic, especially since the new millennium, right? And I would maybe more specifically say since 9/11 even, right? Kind of this question of the empire, what does it mean to be part of the American empire, global empires and things like that. And yet the military kind of pretty consistently got short shrift through a lot of this, that there's this sort of, we know it's there. We see these military figures in the Gospels, and yet we don't do much with that, right? I think there's a number of reasons for that. If you try to read, there's lots of really good stuff out there that's accessible to New Testament scholars. We tend to do stuff, like studying texts, social history, and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, like, if you read, go to ZPE, any recent issue of ZPE, look for anything about the military, and it's damn near impenetrable. It's just very technical stuff that you need to be really deep into to really understand, or it's going to be comparing this, the armor found at this, military site compared to that military site, and what we're supposed to get from this is often very unclear, especially to those of us who are doing New Testament work, where even if you do have experience in archaeology, what exactly are we supposed to make of this? Is this economically significant? Is this, indicating much about this or that thing? It's often unclear. So I think my own work kind of came from that interest in sort of saying, all right, well, hopefully I can kind of identify at least some stuff that's relevant and of interest to the study of Christian origins in the New Testament, and make that, draw upon kind of that really great work that's being done by military historians and kind of make that accessible for people who are interested in these, whether they're scholars, lay people, or what have you. So kind of bridging that gap in some ways between the military historians, where it often is very technical, inaccessible work on the one hand, and kind of making sure that, hey, well, here's the stuff that's clearly part of life in antiquity, right? Clearly there's these Roman soldiers and other soldiers that Paul mentions in the Gospels, and yet we kind of go our way to not talk about it because we don't know as much about these things as we often think we should. So that's kind of where my interest came in. And so even though my dissertation was on Mark, I was really interested in expanding it to be kind of the whole of the New Testament for the book anyway. So, yeah.
Well, this kind of work is so important. You're right. Like the stuff that's just completely impenetrable for us. But we need someone like you to go in and do this work, right? Do this important spade work. And then we have excellent books like yours to be like, oh, thank you for the fruit of that.
Thank you. Yeah, it certainly was like a lot of a steep learning curve with that, right? Because a lot of sort of those kind of images that we kind of are used to, kind of unlearning kind of certain things along the way there, right? Kind of whether it's, what we've seen in movies or kind of, what kind of the assumptions we work on about how the military must have been based on what we know about the military today and things like that. So.
Okay. That leads me to my next question. We didn't even plan that segue. That was perfect. Okay. So you watch movies and, TV shows about Jesus or whatever, and there's all kinds of common depictions of what the military is like. And I think, just in scholarly work, oftentimes there's assumptions that not a lot of deep digging is done there, and just kind of they're presented in a particular way. Can you talk about some of those misconceptions or misrepresentations, or how your work would lead us to see that these are misconceptions and misrepresentations?
Sure. Yeah. One thing I should just know real quick, I have this bag of cheese because I have a dog on my lap and I'm trying to keep her quiet. So don't worry about me doing anything sketchy or anything like that. Here, I'll just let people say hi so they can see a cute dog real quick. This is good, usually a good little pup, but neighbors are moving today, so she's a little bit prone to barking. So I'm trying to make sure she stays a little bit calm with cheese bribery.
Hey, that's a good strategy, and so cute. Such a cute dog.
Thank you. But yeah, so the question about sort of what are some of those misconceptions, right? I think there's a number of them. I think one of the ones that I was really interested in kind of thinking about with this book is that there's this perception that we don't actually know much about the military outside of the Gospels and basically Flavius Josephus when it comes to the military in early Roman Palestine, right? I think that's just kind of what we tend to look towards, like, oh, well, what was going on?
Sure.
Better look to the Gospels and Acts, or look to Josephus, and that's. I think we find that understandable. These things are easy to find, easy to keep at hand, but one thing I was interested in doing is kind of drawing upon a lot of those archaeological resources, especially inscriptions and papyri, because that can really, that is the misconceptions that we don't actually know much about who was doing this, the demographics, what their life was like. And so what I did is, Mark, if you wouldn't mind the slide about DMI perp. Yes, thank you. So one thing that I tried to do is create this database of inscriptions and papyri related to early Roman Palestine, because there was no easy collection of it. There's certainly efforts in there's the kind of efforts to kind of collect corpora and things like of this, but just even being able to say, hey, like, let's look at what the primary sources say beyond these things, because it's one thing to kind of get narrative stories, right? But narrative stories, there's a lot of editorializing and things like that. How do these people represent themselves when they're writing papyri and letters? What are they saying? And so we have, collects, I think, about 400 inscriptions and papyri from early Roman Palestine, which part of this is just kind of make it more accessible if other people want to work on the New Testament or early Christianity, or just the Second Temple Judaism or the early post-temple period, that kind of creating this database where people can research and find those things. So I think that's one misconception, is that we just don't actually know much, or there isn't much there. And so this website tries to address some of that. I think a lot of the other stuff too kind of relates to a monolithic view of the New Testament, that we often tend to flatten things out. And this, for a number of reasons, right? This is kind of a lot of what critical biblical scholarship has been over the past few hundred years, right? Where, whether it's redaction criticism, but at the very least, like, Mark is not doing the same thing as Matthew, who is not doing the same thing as Luke, who is not doing the same thing as John, right? They're all telling different stories. And so with that, trying to separate out what are the distinctive ways in which they imagine the military, what are the distinctive ways in which they understand that to be related to Christian identity, Christian practices, and things like that. So I think that's kind of a misconception that they're all saying the same thing with something else. I was trying to take seriously here and offer a very a literary perspective on these things that takes into account the specific texture of each of the Gospels or each of the biblical authors along the way there.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. Really quickly, I'm saying that I need to remind people, you can ask questions, by the way. So those at home following us, wherever you are live streaming, you are able to come up with questions. So you can send those in, and as we get them, I'll screen them. But we'd love for you to be able to ask questions. So one thing that I found fascinating, and I think this is related to a common misconception that I had before reading your book, was simply, I had a very monolithic understanding of the Roman military. And, I read about Roman soldiers Roman centurion in Mark, and Roman soldiers showing up at various places throughout the Gospels, and, just assumed that these people, and I don't know, this is, I'm embarrassed to say, they were just Romans, right? They were Romans, and they were sent a long ways across the world, and probably knew better if I thought long and hard about it. But you do a really good job of talking about the makeup of the Roman military presence in Roman Palestine. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely.
What demographics, and you mentioned that before, what demographics made up this group of people?
Yeah, it's a great question, or one that at least I'm happy to talk about. So I would also say that for those of you who have not seen on the Herbs and Paulus website, I recently did a blog post that discusses this to some extent anyway. So if you want kind of a more detailed discussion, you might check that out. But I'd say there's kind of what I would identify as like kind of two main misperceptions about demographics that I think are worth noting. The first one, this is kind of what the blog post is thinking about, is namely that the soldiers who are serving were primarily foreigners, or even that they were specifically Roman. We can actually say with a pretty high level of confidence that at least at Jesus' time, And really up until the beginning of the Jewish War, there were very few what I would call foreign or specifically Roman soldiers in Palestine. And when I say Roman, I mean the level of Roman citizen. Certainly, they worked in some sense as part of the Roman military apparatus, but these were people who were not necessarily having Roman citizenship. Rather, the vast majority of them fell into two categories. First of which would be the auxilia. This is in specifically the Roman province of Judea, where basically in a model that was adopted later by the French Foreign Legion, you could, in exchange for 20 years of military service, you would get Roman citizenship at the end of it. And this would also be extended to your wife and any children you had as well. So this is to say these are people who definitely do not have Roman citizenship. In fact, we know that most of them are recruited from the two cities of Sebaste and Caesarea Maritima. So specific cities within the province of Judea, we know that the vast majority of these auxiliaries were recruited from. The other category would be kind of soldiers of the client king. So, this would be like Herod Antipas, Herod Philip, Agrippa, this kind of the Herodian dynasty, the Herodian family, had their own individual armies, right? And these were just locally recruited. We don't know a ton about that of Herod Antipas or Philip, but we actually do have quite a bit about Herod Agrippa II. There's actually quite a few inscriptions of his soldiers, and there's every indication that these were people who were recruited from within his little kingdom, and this is the way they made a living. This is kind of found prominence in their local society. So I'd say this misperception about demographics of foreigners would be perhaps the first one that I want to highlight. The second one I would also say is related to class, and I think this is in large part because the New Testament, I think, is really oriented towards, when we find discussion of soldiers, it's really centurions, tribunes, Pontius Pilate, the governor, that these are the individuals who get names. So I think we often tend to default and think, oh, Roman soldier, not only equals foreigner, but equals someone who has a certain amount of wealth. And relative to much of society, they're doing fairly well, right? The kind of the common soldiers, I would say, the vast majority of soldiers who are just, foot soldiers or kind of low-level equestrians, certainly they can count on food, a regular paycheck, not going into debt and things like that. But by and large, what we find in most Roman writings is thinking of Roman soldiers as being kind of at the bottom of society. They actually were thought of as being lower class. And in fact, that's where a lot of the recruitment came from, especially in the time of the Roman Principate, at that time of the New Testament. So I think those would be two, what I would call like kind of misconceptions, at least in terms of demographics, about the military and the New Testament, or New Testament Palestine anyway. That
right. So yeah, okay. I just have a quick follow-up questions, and these aren't ones I gave you before, so Can you talk to us a little bit about the size of, what we might imagine the number of soldiers that like a client king might have available?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the client king, so we know a bit more about Judea, in part just because Josephus is more interested in the Roman province of Judea. Yeah. Josephus has a very low view of both client king soldiers and auxilia. He doesn't actually really have a lot to say about them. He really just cares about the legionaries. These are the real ones that are worth talking about for him. But we would say around the time, basically Roman Judea from 6 of the Common Era up till the beginning of the Jewish War in 66 of the Common Era, has about 3,000 soldiers or so that are serving there. So it's a handful of these cohorts of about 600 soldiers, one of which seems to have been kind of a cavalry unit, but the remaining 5 seem to have been just sort of regular foot soldiers there. We don't know quite as much about, like I said, Herod Antipas, so where, Jesus was living. We don't know the specifics, but we do know, for instance, that a large chunk of Agrippa II, so he's serving, he's king of Batanea, I want to say from like 58 of the Common Era up until the end of the 1st century, so definitely overlapping with the New Testament a bit. Sure. he seems to have a force in the multiple thousands of soldiers that he's recruited as well. So, and there seem to be indications that at least by the time of the first century, these armies are really built on a specifically Roman model. So that when we look at kind of Herod the Great and the Hasmoneans, there's a lot more influence of the Greek armies, the Hellenistic armies. But by the time of the first century, these kind of, and throughout the kind of the periphery of the Roman Empire, there's a lot of these little client kingdoms, often very small. Judea is, in fact, one of the biggest ones. But like Nabatea right nearby, among other ones, that they really adopt a very specifically Roman model and use Roman terms like a centurion for an officer of 100 soldiers, right? That we find kind of specifically Roman terminology, Roman structure, and kind of other ways that they're kind of built upon the Roman model by that time of the first century. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. In Judea, and this is another one, just kind of a personal answer. How are they dispersed? The 3,000. How are they dispersed throughout Judea?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so like that's maybe another misconception. I think we tend to think of soldiers as a really urban phenomenon, and in many ways they were, right? Like I think in large part in the Gospels, we really only encounter soldiers in a few locations specifically. So like there's a centurion at Capernaum, but really we think of Jerusalem itself, that, kind of that, not the capital, but at least what we think of as like kind of the cultural capital anyway of Judea, where there's a huge, number of pilgrims among other people who live there. And, but in fact, what we find through a number of archaeological excavations, that there's a number of like just sort of very small little fortlets that are regularly peppered along the roads throughout. So kind of what seems to be, it might be just two soldiers where, hey, you know what, we're just going to do our patrol for the day and then we're going to go back and hang out in our little, frankly, a crappy little shack that they live in. That's kind of just what they do, right? And we kind of find that there's a lot of smaller locations where they're living. In fact, if this is something that if you're interested in this, one of the books that I'm wrapping up right now would be published as a special issue of the journal Aquila Legionis. Will kind of be an expanded version of my website, the database of military inscriptions. Prior to early Roman Palestine, that will have kind of more information about, hey, how big were, kind of what's the dispersal look like in these different locations? How many soldiers roughly were there at this little archaeological site? So a lot of this is just sort of kind of, all right, we have all these little individual archaeological sites that there's been work on. Let's kind of group those into one big set of information. What do we actually notice when we kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the big picture as opposed to, Abu Ghash, what's happening there, or, Kiryat Yearim or something like that. Let's take a look at the region as a whole and how do we see that dispersal of soldiers. So it can be a lot. I think it's probably about a cohort was devoted to Jerusalem just because there's so many people there. But otherwise, it can be 2, 3, a dozen soldiers at the site, often not very many. So yeah.
In a cohort, we're talking about 600.
We're talking about 600. So yeah.
I think one misconception is people just kind of assume Jerusalem's teeming with Roman soldiers everywhere.
Right.
But it's a pretty small number compared to the population, right?
Yeah. Relative to the population, it's not that much, right? Like, they certainly have this very prominent fortress, the Antonia Fortress. It's right next to the temple. But it's, probably more get called in for the time of like, Jewish festivals and things like that, just to make sure, the way things always happen, right? I think of sort of, here in Toronto, back a decade ago, there was the G8 summit here. So a lot more police were called in because they knew there were going to be protesters and things like that.
Yeah, crowd
control. Yeah, exactly. Sort of the crowd control type approach. But by and large, you're right. Like it's sort of, this is not as though like it's the, I think 1984 or something like that, where you're imagining kind of soldiers everywhere listening to you, peering over your shoulder and things like that. And I think it's a common image, and one that I think, again, often the films we watch are where that gets perpetuated as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, talk about, and I found this part of your work pretty fascinating. Talk about religious identity of some of these soldiers in Palestine. I think there could be a misconception connected to that as well.
So maybe they can connect to that misconception, like the foreigners, is this misconception that to be a soldier, you are required to affirm, the emperor as, Divi Filius, son of the gods, and or at least you need to follow various what we would call broadly like pagan rituals anyway, right?
Yeah.
In fact, we find there's a remarkable diversity among the soldiers, religious diversity among the soldiers of not just early Roman Palestine, but throughout the Roman world in general. So we often find, so one example that's pretty interesting is in Roman Gerasa. So the Gerasene demoniac takes place there. There's like this monument where it was pretty clear that basically whenever any soldiers get stationed out there, the first thing they do is like devote themselves to the local gods of Gerasa.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, then they kind of like make a sacrifice, say, hey, we want to make sure we're on the good side of these local gods and things like that. And part of what worked for the Roman army is precisely because they are so heavily recruiting foreigners or people who are not citizens, so that these are diverse people with diverse cults that they're participating in. And we do find, in fact, that there are a number of Jewish people and eventually Christians as well who served in the Roman military, right? Evidence for this is often hard to find, but we do notice, for instance, hey, there's very clearly Jewish names of this soldier, of that soldier, or sometimes, there'll be a phrase in Hebrew on, a soldier's epitaph, right? So on their tombstone, they might have, say, shalom or something like that, or have olive branches or, a candelabra, menorah on their inscription as well. And these would suggest that maybe even if they're not, ethnically Jewish, or maybe if they're not, what we would call Jewish in the sense of sort of being strictly devoted to only one cult, that at least they don't see this as being incompatible with what they're otherwise doing.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. That you certain that you could have. I mean, I think most people, watching television or movies about this would never assume that any of these soldiers might identify as Jewish.
Yeah, it's certainly like it's a time where it's very tumultuous too, right? So like that relationship between Rome and Judea, obviously the Jewish War, and then there's the War of the Quietists and the Bar Kokhba War. So 3 Jewish-Roman wars in relatively quick succession over the course of 50 years. That's certainly a big part of like the cultural memory. But we do have clearly people who were seen to be Jewish in some sense of the word, right? So whether it's in the sense they're ethnos, whether in the sense of they have some kind of connection to the Jewish deity, still, don't see this sort of inherent compatibility. And there's this, for me, that was really, I would just refer, I'll plug another book real quick that I did. The Essential Essays for the Study of the Military in First Century Palestine. This is one that it's an edited collection of just sort of important essays that I think are often not read enough. And one of the essays that's in there is by Andrew Schoenfeld, which is just like this really great look at just sort of look, here's a ton of examples of Jewish people serving in the Hellenistic armies, in the Roman army. Ultimately, it stops in the Byzantine army because there's kind of a ban on Jewish soldiers as part of Christendom at one point. So kind of that discrimination. But there's just a ton of this evidence. I would absolutely encourage people. You can Google the article, Andrew Schoenfeld. It's Sons of Israel in Caesar's Service. I kind of summarize a bit of that in the blog post as well on Persepolis. But yeah, just exactly right. I don't think this is the type of thing people normally think of, that when we mention who is part of the Roman army, I think Jewish people are maybe one of the last things that comes to mind. And Rome did allow a lot of flexibility with cultic practices and the demands put on people because, hey, we need to recruit a lot of people. Substantial portion of the population may worship this god and have certain things they refuse to do or are willing to do only at certain times, and they're willing to accommodate. That is to say, the Roman army is willing to accommodate in a lot of these situations.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think we have this kind of. I mean, often people come to the text of the Gospels and just kind of have this sharp demarcation between Jews and everyone else, and I think what we see is there's more of a the boundary between them is more permeable than I think we often want to, or people often recognize, right?
I think permeable is a
little bit back and forth, and certainly there's going to be some Jews that would never cross that line.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. So there's this whole range of like, what does it mean to, like kind of what's permissible and what's not permissible. Paula Fredrickson's obviously done some really good work. I think it's in her recent book on Paul. Just kind of fascinating look at kind of, hey, here's examples of Jewish people who dedicate their slave to, a pagan god or whatever, right? And like these are the type of things where Judaism had a wide variety of practices. And I would say one thing I would caution against, I think kind of your phrasing implies this as well. So there are permeable boundaries, and I would say it's not really our place to say this person's a good Jew, this person's a bad Jew, but it just sort of a wide diversity of understanding of what's important, what the practices are, and things like that. So absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly helpful. I believe we have a question from Sarah Rollins. Hold on, let me put down my chat so I can actually read the question. All right, question. I'm going to take this question now. Do you have any thoughts on Luke's rather positive evaluation of soldiers in Luke 3? The soldiers who come out to see John the Baptist baptizing ask him what they should do. What do you think he's trying to do by including this?
All right. Well, thank you for the question, Sarah. So Luke is kind of famous. Luke Acts more broadly, I'm going to assume they're written by the same person here. I think this has come a little under controversy recently, but I'm just going to assume it's the same author here. Is sort of kind of famous for being very positive in its depiction of the military in general, right? So we think of the centurion Cornelius in Acts 10. We think of the centurion Julius in Acts 27. Even sort of the healing, or not the healing, the centurion at the cross, the phrasing is much more unambiguous in its sort of positiveness. And kind of, what Sarah's pointing to here in Luke chapter 3, verse 14, where John the Baptist kind of having the back and forth with different crowds, hey, what should we do? And with the soldiers, he's got this, it's kind of hilarious, like how low his standards are. It's basically like, just don't extort people and be content with your wages. This is, just imagine telling that to anyone on the job now, right? Like, just be happy with what you're doing and don't steal money don't take money out of the cash register at the end of the day, right? It's a very low standard. But I think what it kind of disguises part of what Luke is doing, in that Luke, I think, ultimately wants to imagine soldiers as being positive forces. And in this case, I would think of kind of, we have this perception of extortion as theft, I think is how we tend to think of it. It's a crime for us today. But really, in antiquity, it seems to be thought of as this sort of what I would call like the honest grift. That's, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Casino. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's what? Yeah. Okay. So you've seen the movie Casino, but kind of part of it is like there's the money counters in the back who they just need to go through the bills and count things. And kind of part of the movie's depicted that, hey, you know what? They're going to take money, right? If you're counting money, you're going to steal some of it, right? The problem is like when you're stealing too much of it, right? Or it can be a problem in certain situations, but you just assume we trust the guys who are counting money enough to only take what they know is a negligible amount of money. And kind of that's what it was with the military as well. It's like, they actually don't get paid that well. How soldiers made a lot of their money was by going to war and taking loot. And by extorting people, right? Kind of similar to how, kind of the tax collectors in antiquity as well. It's sort of how you made your money is sort of what you collect beyond what you're officially owed. And there's something similar going on with the soldiers. And so I think Luke is kind of, in that context, wanting to imagine extortion as a benign thing in a certain way that kind of doesn't really reflect the reality of a lot of people's experience in antiquity. So I think Luke, at least as I would argue it, tends to have a pretty positive view of soldiers. And I think you can see that here, where it's this very low standard, in some ways disguises this sort of the processes of extortion and of violence that were kind of inherent to life as a soldier, right? They're defined precisely by their ability to meet up violence. So that's a great question, Sarah. Thank you so much for asking that.
Yeah. And Sarah, if you have a follow-up, fire away. And I believe we have another question coming in. Is that right, Mark? You want to shoot that up there? This is from Nathan Haynes. What are your thoughts on the specifically named Italian cohorts? The one that Cornelius was named to be a part of, and also Julius, who took Paul to Rome. Do you believe these were the auxiliary cohorts made up of Roman citizens?
All right, great question. Yeah, so there's these are the ones in Acts of the Apostles. So Cornelius is in Acts 10. He's said to be part of the Italian cohort. And then Julius, who sends Paul to Rome, is said to be part of the Augustan cohort. And these are kind of controversial points because we don't actually have evidence in Palestine anyway, in Roman Judea, of an Italian cohort at the time. The best guess is that all the units at that point were kind of named cohors Sebastanorum, that is to say the cohort from the city of Sebaste, and then just numbered 1 through 5, basically. There is some evidence for an Augustan cohort in having some connection to Herod Agrippa II's kingdom of Batanea, but it kind of gets into this deeper question about how historical are these episodes, as well as sort of what, and even beyond that, what is Luke actually imagining, right? So even, whether it's historical or not, what is Luke actually wanting to depict here? So I tend to be skeptical of the reliability of Acts. That's just me. But I think we can still nonetheless think about what is Luke wanting to depict, what is Luke trying to accomplish by telling the story in this particular way. I think these are actually pretty good examples of Luke Acts having a very positive view of the Roman military, because Cornelius is that first Gentile convert to Christianity that Acts 10 is devoted to him, but then kind of Acts 11 is kind of devoted to the implications of Cornelius and the kind of the Gentiles in the church, right? With Julius, I think there's kind of it actually acts very well in terms of the culmination of Acts. It's Acts ends shortly afterwards, and but I think it's kind of telling that what's going on here is that there's a centurion named Julius who's taking Paul from Caesarea to the city of Rome, and he's part of the Augustan cohort. I think these names, there's actually a lot of baggage. So Julius, who is in Caesarea, so very similar to Julius Caesar. He's part of the Augustan cohort. We think of, Augustus, and they're going to the city of Rome. Whether or not it's historical, there's certainly a lot of symbolic value that's here that I think at least the author of Acts is wanting us to think of this as sort of the culmination of Acts is Paul's arrival and the arrival of Christianity in the city of Rome. In many ways, occupying an important place in the empire, kind of the sort of a sort of symbolic conquest of Rome in some ways. And I think you can see bits of that throughout Acts in general. But I think that's kind of what's going on there. I would think that my guess would be, in terms of whether or not, to go back specifically to Nathan's question, I do think the language that Acts uses, he refers to as spera is the Greek word there, that usually refers to the Latin, or kind of, not referred to, but kind of relate to the Latin cohors. That usually would indicate an auxiliary unit who is a non-citizen. Although that's, with the Italians, it gets a little more complicated because there's actually this weird auxiliary citizen cohort. It's a very bizarre thing in its own right. Some people have thought that might be what this is, but I would refer, actually it's reprinted here too if you're interested, Nathan. Michael Spidel has this famous article that was published in, Ancient Society back in the 1980s, where he kind of looks at the evidence for these units. You might be able to Google it as well. But I think it's Michael Spidel. If you just search for, Michael Spidel, Acts 10, or, Acts 27 or Julius, or, something like that, you should be able to find it online easy enough. But so that's a great question. It gets very complicated there, with that question of the historical issue, but also the literary issue of what is Luke imagining, what is Luke trying to depict, what is he trying to call to mind for the reader when these things are being depicted. So great question, Nathan. Thank you.
Hey, I want to follow. Yeah, it's a great question. I want to follow up on some of the things that you said there. I've kind of been under the impression that some of what Acts, and I think I'm not the only one, many people have been under this impression that some of what Acts is trying to do is demonstrate the compatibility between the Christian faith and between Rome, right?
Yeah.
That we can coexist, and every time, basically every time a Christian is in front of a Roman official, it goes well, right? They're found innocent. They're not a problem. Good, faithful citizens. And I wonder if I mean, I found this interesting. I've never thought about it till today, but attaching Italian cohort to a Cornelius, and attaching Augustan cohort and Julius, and I mean, I wonder if that's you put those details on there, and it just I wonder if that's an effort by Luke to just make these figures, images or ideal pictures of Rome and Christianity working together, right?
I would completely agree with this. Absolutely. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I would agree with that characterization. I think Luke, to my mind, you're right. I think tries to show that compatibility between Rome broadly construed. So whether it's the administrative apparatus, the military apparatus, that these are ultimately not irreconcilable with Christianity or anything like that. And I think you're right as well. I would completely agree. I think that a lot of what this is kind of like little characterizations to cue for the reader. All right, when I say a centurion, I specifically have in mind someone who is Italian, right? So think Rome across the sea there, right? Or someone named Julius. So someone who has a Roman name. Again, it would seem like there's that tension between it seems to be an auxiliary cohort, and yet they have Roman names, right? So
It happens to be the name of one of the most important,
right?
imperial figures, right? Yeah,
exactly. So these little things I think do a lot to signify for the reader this relationship, and to simply, whether or not they're historical is to my mind almost irrelevant, right? Like to me, it's more interesting, sort of like what is Luke doing with this? This is an incidental detail that Luke puts in there. Probably for a reason. You totally could have just as easily made this centurion anonymous, and yet, hey, you need to know this is, someone from Italy. You need to know this is someone named Julius, and that itself suggests that it has some connection to what Luke is trying to accomplish in telling this particular story. Right? Absolutely.
Yeah. I think you're definitely right about that. Yeah. All right. Talk to us a little bit about what you discovered or what your book tells us about the role and the function of soldiers, Roman soldiers in general, but Roman soldiers maybe in particular in Palestine. I found that to be really fascinating and helpful to me. Share a little bit about that with our audience.
Sure, absolutely. So I think soldiers are complex figures. In antiquity, I would kind of divide kind of what they do, their function up into basically kind of two different categories. Sort of what I call the official functions, that is what their explicit purpose is, but also they do a lot of unofficial things as well that, they serve a lot of purposes beyond why they're explicitly there. So those official things would obviously be things like warfare, right? Be things like policing, but also kind of even more, I guess, maybe benign things than that. I would call it aqueduct construction, for instance. We know that some of the aqueducts to Caesarea were constructed by soldiers because we've got the inscriptions that say, hey, this particular unit of this particular legion, built this section and things like that. We've got a whole bunch of those that survive.
No.
So those are kind of what I would call like the official functions. I think that's what we tend to think of anyway, right? Like for obvious reasons, right? That's what their explicit purpose is. When we read, Suetonius or any of the ancient histories, that's what they're really interested in, is talking about the warfare and things like that. Yeah. But then there's a lot of the unofficial purpose, I would actually say, is more important because the vast majority of the time soldiers are not fighting, right? You're not, sold roughly 30 legions in the Roman Empire, roughly as many auxiliaries as well. And very few of those are actually involved in combat at any given time. And there's a lot of soldiers would simply go from, recruitment to retirement without ever having, shed any blood at all, at least in combat. So what are you doing otherwise, right? Like you don't have that many people paying them that much if just to sit on their hands or build aqueducts, right? You can pay people who are not trained to build aqueducts. So I think these unofficial purposes, I would actually connect largely to economic issues. That one of the really important functions of the soldiers is economic integration, especially of these sort of frontier regions like Judea and Palestine into the region. So this would be things like they would be involved in kind of markets emerging in certain areas. If you put a garrison in a particular area, it does not take long for kind of a settlement, a town to emerge around that, right? Another big part is the monetization of the economy. That money, in fact, is not very common, especially in rural Judea In fact, there's almost no coinage at all in Galilee at the time. But the military, because these are people who are paid in coin, who move around and things like that. In fact, what they do is they really help inject money into the economy and kind of create economies that are dependent upon that. And kind of also among these unofficial purposes would be things like dispute mediation. That a lot of what soldiers do is kind of mediate problems that that's not really what they're intended to do, but we find there's a couple examples from Palestine, but we have a lot more from Egypt just because the papyri survive much better from Egypt than they do from Palestine. And so just a ton of examples of petitions of Joe Schmo or Jane Schmo to a local centurion saying, hey, I've got this problem. So-and-so keeps harassing me. Can you please just come down here and get him to lay off? Or, so-and-so stole my horses and is refusing to acknowledge it. I've got proof. Please just come down here. It's because in a lot of rural areas where there aren't, kind of administrators who can see these things, that centurion who's got his, 8 soldiers with him or whatever, because they're just a very small outpost. Well, that's the closest authority you got. And because they have the law, or at least the threat of violence on their side, that these are the people you appeal to kind of make sure things have some sort of predictability to life, that people can't just steal your stuff, that problems can get resolved in an orderly way, as the case may be.
Would that be almost like on informal policing, right? Like
yeah,
there's somebody you could go to and get to step in on your behalf, if you're being mistreated or
I think informal policing is a good way to characterize it, because it's how often, especially in rural areas, would soldiers patrol a hamlet of 200 people? Well, it's probably not a big priority at that point unless there's a lot of problems nearby or something like that. And yet, hey, there's an outpost 3 towns, 4 towns over. We can just get someone over there, whether it's writing a letter or just send someone out there to do that. That's a way that they can kind of informally kind of police and kind of people can kind of like resolve issues. And what's interesting is we actually find like all strata of society people do this. Often that kind of people at the very bottom of society will make their situation sound as pathetic as possible in hopes that this official will feel sympathetic to them, right? So, hey, I'm a widow, I'm this old, I don't have any children, please come out here, right? Whereas you find other people like, hey, you better take me seriously, I'm a priest of this, local cult, I've got Roman citizenship, you need to come out here, like, tell these people what's what, right? So from all strata of society in these rural areas, people seem to be appealing to them, which it's kind of curious anyway. I feel like it's just kind of an interesting thing there. So thank you. That's a great question, Adam.
Yeah, thank you. And that was an excellent answer. That was helpful. All right. It looks like we have some more questions coming in. So, Mark, you want to shoot up a question from our audience? Okay. Question. We are now more aware of prevalence of sexual violence by soldiers in recent conflicts and occupations. What evidence is there of sexual violence by soldiers in Palestine against women and men?
Sure. So I would want to preface this by obviously giving a content warning to anyone watch this, because it's going to be hard to talk about this without talking about sexual violence and rape. So you may want to mute, and I would just ask Mark maybe leave this up until it's done, and then people can know if they need to mute it or click ahead. That's a sign that we've moved on. So this is a fact of life. It is a fact that there's extensive sexual violence. We've got evidence specific to Roman Palestine. For instance, sort of the Talmudic literature presumes that any woman who is spending time with a Roman soldier has been raped. It does not assume this about bandits. It does not assume this about other people. It presumes anyone who is a Roman soldier has raped a woman. And so this is they're talking about sages who are the Tanaim, who are living, roughly in the late Second Temple period, shortly after the destruction of the temple as well. So this is, roughly contemporaneous with what we're talking about with the Gospels being composed, or even the life of Jesus itself. So there's extensive, that's how they talk about it. And we can find plenty of instances of this as well. whether it's in Roman literature, where it's just very casually stated things like, hey, soldiers coming to town, there's a war, and they just did whatever they wanted to with any youth, male or female, that they found. We find there's also kind of the famous images of Claudius. It's somewhere in Turkey, I'm forgetting where exactly it is, but there's two statues, one of Nero subduing a personification of Armenia, one of Claudius subduing a personification of Britannia, heavily implying in this personification of Armenia and Britannia are both female, they're both in a state of undress, and it's presumed that rape is immediately what follows what you see being depicted here. And this is how Roman emperors depicted themselves. This is the metaphor they used themselves to depict sort of the treatment of people on the frontier regions and things like that. So this seems to be mostly directed against people where there was little recourse, so non-citizens, people on the frontier regions and things like that. And one thing, there's this other question that I know David's a great scholar who's done some important work on this about Jesus himself and the cross. Was Jesus, would we characterize what happened to Jesus on the cross in some sense as sexual abuse, sexual assault, or even rape? Because certainly there's undressing, forced undressing, we would call sexual abuse in our culture, to say the least, right? That much is recounted in the Gospels themselves. And then it turns to this question about what is typical, what would have happened to Jesus, forced nudity, things like that. And so that at the cross, and there's kind of other questions related to this with the New Testament as well, kind of this question of sexual violence. But yes, certainly we do have clear evidence from it, from Palestine. I can't remember the full name of the article, but I know Benjamin Isaac. I should say anyone's free to email me if they want bibliographic references, but Benjamin Isaac had an article where he talked a bit about sort of the rabbinic passages related to sexual violence in Palestine at the time. Very, very difficult question, but absolutely an important one to ask, David. So thank you so much for that.
David, thank you for that question. Excellent question. And next, we have a question from Aaron Roberts. Can you put that up there? If most soldiers are in a lower economic class, is Josephus unusual given his education and literacy, or does he represent a different type of military personnel?
That's a good question. Yeah, so Josephus, he was a big part of that sort of the rebels against in the Jewish war there, right? And yet he clearly is very literate, right? He produced the monumental Antiquities of the Jews, so that 20-volume work, the 7-volume Jewish War, not to mention his own autobiography, as well as some defensive or kind of apologetic work as well. So to what extent were soldiers literate? Well, we do have some examples, again, mostly from Egypt, because it's where papyri survive best, of soldiers corresponding with relatives or things like that. My impression largely, though, is that you kind of have a literate within a camp of a certain size who it's going to be their responsibility to, for instance, do the bookkeeping, going to be writing the letters for soldiers, probably for pay. They're probably not doing this for free if they're corresponding with their own family and things like that. So I think Josephus, I would think, at least by this point, he's kind of from the upper strata of society. Certainly he's depicted as being someone, at least as he wants to represent himself anyway, as being kind of at the higher levels of the rebel army and things like that. So I should clarify, maybe I could have been more explicit with this earlier, is that I think it's often the low-ranking soldiers tend to be from lower class, and really it's kind of that rank of centurion where things are pivotal, that some centurions come from lower classes. It's really the highest you could get if you're what we would call today a non-commissioned officer, basically if you're just kind of rising through the ranks. But some people were commissioned at the rank of centurion and moving up. So kind of centurion's the lowest rank for the aristocrats, but the highest rank for kind of the Joe Schmoes on the street. So it's kind of this weird pivotal figure, and that may explain, at least in part, why the centurion is so important in the New Testament. I don't know. But I do think Josephus is a bit unusual. I would probably attribute to him kind of an aristocratic stance. And with that, we see kind of him being at kind of the higher levels of the rebel movement and so on. Certainly he is engaging in combat himself, but he at least depicts himself as sort of that the governor of rebel Galilee at a certain point, right? So yeah, it's a great question, Robert. Or excuse me, Robert. Aaron Roberts. It's a great question, Aaron. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, it seems, and it might be a little. I mean, would you say that? I mean, the Jewish rebel forces are probably a little different in makeup than the Roman army that you're talking about in your book, right?
That's a good point too. Yeah, because whereas like the Roman army is professionalized in some sense, right?
Yeah.
Like this is you're making a career out of this. You're planning on doing this for at least 20 years, really probably 25, 30. Some soldiers do it for 50 years, basically their whole life. Whereas when we think of the Jewish rebel army, these are people who, for whatever reason, feel compelled to take up arms against Rome. But very few of them are going to have been soldiers. Probably some of them were, but I'm going to guess it's a very small portion of the population, the rebel population, would have been that professional class of soldiers, and may well have largely consisted of, peasants taking up arms, partisans of this or that group, things like that. So absolutely great point there, Adam.
And we got one. I think this is going to be our last question. We're running short on time. We have one more question. Can you go put that up there, Mark? All right. Let's see. The Roman army, regarding the Roman army in the New Testament, can you share some areas of research that you believe deserves further exploration? Are there any new directions or trends worth mentioning?
Well, thank you so much, Russ. That's a great question. Yeah. It's a good one to kind of end with as well, I think. So one of my colleagues, I teach mostly at Ryerson University. I do some teaching at the University of Toronto as well. A colleague at the University of Toronto, she's doing her PhD, Rebecca Runeson Stanfordson, is doing her research on kind of cultic mobility. And she's interested, not specifically in the New Testament, but early Christianity, kind of transmission of cults, including Christianity, but not specifically New Testament period. And just doing fascinating work in social scientific models. She's presented some really good work at SBL in the past, and everything that I've seen from her has just been absolutely outstanding. So really cool work about kind of, questions about kind of conversion, or at least adopting, these different religions and different cults. Why do people do that? What does that process look like? I think kind of what she's doing is exciting because it's kind of looking at networks that emerge, specifically in Egypt about, we've got these archives of papyri of different soldiers, and how do they transmit knowledge among each other? So I would say she's doing really exciting work, and I'm really excited to see how her dissertation ends up. I'm of course excited to hear any paper that she delivers as well. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done thinking about early Christianity as well, kind of that post-biblical period of what we often call the patristic, or kind of late antiquity. About kind of shifting attitudes, right? What we find it kind of in the early period, there tends to be some more hostility towards the military. For instance, Origen seems to think you can't be a soldier and a Christian. You got to pick one or the other. There's inherent incompatibility. And yet, perhaps not surprisingly, shortly after Constantine's conversion, kind of the Christianization of the empire, we find a very big shift there, such that the writer Vegetius, talks about oaths that Christian soldiers have to give, really connecting the power of the emperor to the power of God in the process. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that. There's been some good work, but I think kind of ideological shifts, political shifts, as well as sort of how this fit into the politics of individual patristic writers as well. So I think I'd say patristic stuff, there's a lot of work to be done. And I would say my own work, it's all exploratory at this point still. It's kind of creating that database website, the DMI perp, armyofromanpalestine.com. Part of that was to kind of just create space for conversation for other people to say, hey, do you make these same things of these texts that I do? So this isn't just be a determinative, this isn't say it's the only interpretation, but hey, these things are out there. You can find other writers who are, here's a short bibliography on each of these. Maybe you'll find something there that you notice things that I don't. We got a different interpretation of it. So I feel like without those primary sources, those non-literary primary sources, I think there's some exciting stuff to still be done on a lot of that as well. So great question, Ross.
That's an excellent resource. Yeah, I'm glad to know it. Okay, we lied. We're gonna do one more. We're gonna do one more question. And so, can you throw that up there? This is from Robin Walsh. A follow up question to Aaron's question. How does Josephus's status as a Pharisee factor into your answer to Aaron, if at all?
I tend to actually not think of Josephus as a Pharisee. And this is kind of one of those maybe controversial issues in biblical studies or Second Temple studies, at least at the moment. But I tend to think that he wasn't, in fact, a Pharisee, but more just sort of expressing a certain amount of sympathy and kind of wanting to claim, to use sort of the language of Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, the social anthropologist, philosopher, that there's a certain amount of cultural capital associated with being a Pharisee that I think he's wanting to claim there. Certainly, the Pharisees are known for being a literate class, and I think maybe that's part of what's going on there too. Is sort of that Josephus, as someone who's kind of part of like this literate class of the oral Torah and things like that, and maybe that there's a connection to be drawn there too. That's kind of part of what maybe makes him unique, and maybe not unique, but unusual at least in terms of his being kind of a military officer, clearly very literate, writing high level literature, stuff that's, I don't know, maybe Hebrew is higher level literacy than Josephus, but otherwise far better written than any New Testament author, I would go so far to say, in terms of that sophistication, the kind of the level of syntax and grammar, things like that. So I would think that would probably have something to do with it as well, that he's someone who is wanting to align himself ideologically with the Pharisees, but nevertheless comes from a similar class where literacy is valued, study of texts closely is valued, kind of recounting the wisdom of the sages and things like that is valued as well. So that's just my own sense, but I shall say I'm not an expert in Pharisees, much less Josephus, but that's my own take on it anyway. That's a great question, Robin. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Robin. Hey, I think this brings us to the end of our time together. There's still some more issues we could have explored, but that leaves the book for people to purchase and read. It's an excellent book, an excellent resource. And get to our website and put your name in for the free book giveaway, which includes this excellent book by Chris. So, Chris, this is great. It was really good talking about your book with you and getting to interact with you. I appreciate it. Everyone following along at home, appreciate your questions. Chris, I'll give you any last words. I'll give it to you.
Well, thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate the chance to get to meet you. Thank you for the great questions. And I really appreciate everyone who's viewed this and sent in some fantastic questions as well today. So yeah, please check out the book, or at least try to get the free version of it through the giveaway. Thanks to everyone else at Herbs and Paulus today, including Mark behind the scenes for helping out with this, and everyone for sending questions and watching today. Wishing everyone the best, as at least here in Toronto, it's a very hot October, so hopefully everyone's staying at least relatively cool where they are at the moment.
Thank you very much, Chris. See you later, everyone.